sharing. And what I'd like to do is really divide it up in a number of different ways. First, just provide a summary. What's the overall focus of the talk? Then think about the legal and normative framework that we're very familiar with from all our different spheres of research and disciplines. The evidence on the trends. Let's look at what's actually changed over the last decades and see whether or not the glass is half full or half empty. Look at emerging threats and lessons and recommendations. So what I'm going to argue is that we've clearly had international declarations for gender equality for 3/4 of a century, from the UN Charter when it was founded after the Second World War through the SDGs, the Agenda 2030. And all of these have repeatedly endorsed bedrock principles, as we know, of gender equality and women's rights. This is nothing new. It's been a long process, and it's an incremental process where we've added to the formal recognition, and the UN and its member states and the human rights conventions have expanded. At the same time, what I'm arguing is that many of the indicators we use to monitor progress, particularly within the UN and the SDGs, have really focused too narrowly, looking at advances in the long term on the percentage of women in elected office. Is that important? Yes. Is it enough? No. These gains in particular in the number of women in office have occurred in many regions and many countries, but they don't necessarily mean, of course, empowerment, especially when understood multidimensionally, as involving cultural power, which is about attitudes and values, civic power within NGOs and within social movements, decision-making at the very top, and we're talking, of course, about the presidents and prime ministers of the world, as well as those in top leadership positions in management or in companies or in other areas of professional life, and policy empowerment above all, where I think we can see quite evident pushback on many of the gains that we all thought had been moving forward. And my claim is that if we look at the evidence, progress across all four dimensions has often slowed and been uneven worldwide. And indeed, there is good evidence now, pretty solid, of backsliding, not just in democracy, but very much in women's rights in recent years. Now, why? Well, I think that there are a number of factors. Obviously, there have been some advances in cultural values, particularly those supporting ideas of gender equality, LGBTQ rights, issues of women in the workplace, issues of sex role, and all of those other aspects which are so critical. People's values have changed, but what that's done is sparked a counter-reaction. And in my book, I argue the socially conservative groups, in particular authoritarian populists, and anti-gender social movements have mobilized around these issues because they feel threatened. Because as support for liberal values has expanded, their own traditional values on marriage and the family, on issues of children and child raising, on issues of sexuality and binary divisions between men and women in sex roles, on issues of women in the workplace and in power, have increasingly come under threat. So it's a measure of our success on the one hand, but also we need to revise our tactics and strategies to really know how effective to counter the rollback, which is so strong, even in what was seen as some of the bastions which were leading the way in terms of gender equality, including the United States. And so growing polarizations has exacerbated threats and the acts of violence against women, including in decision-making positions, including in parliaments. And that's a fundamental challenge in the public sphere that's now increasingly recognized. And COVID, of course, the most recent event, has weakened women's positions in a number of ways, both as vulnerable populations, like in the elderly and with children, reverse gains in schools and in workplace, heightened risks of domestic violence, sidelined parliaments, which were always weak and have got weaker, postponed elections in some cases, undermined democracy in general, and thereby weakened human rights and women's rights. So what we need to do, I think, is the next steps is really develop not just single indicators of the proportion of women in parliament, but comprehensive, multidimensional, sex-segregated indices. It can be done when official statistics departments break down the data on a regular, systematic way over time through looking at men and women in each of those different spheres. At present, however, the evidence remains very patchy. We need to address the impact of COVID. It might seem as though it's in the rearview mirror, but I think it really is continuing, and most importantly, it's had a lasting legacy after the major effects have declined, particularly on threats to violence against women and a polarization in society. And we need to identify, above all, effective strategies to defend and resist anti-gender movements, which are pushing back on reproductive rights, pushing back on rights for the gay community, pushing back on issues which women have seen as critical in the workplace and in power as well. So let's look at some of the legal and normative frameworks. I mean, we're very familiar with this. So for this audience, I don't think I need to reiterate the ways in which the world has come together to think about issues of women's equality, and how, and by the way, that's a very young Hillary Clinton there addressing the World's Convention, the 4th annual conference. And we've seen, of course, the SDGs and the way that the world has defined the changes that they see in the next period until 2030, built on the MDGs. And of course, it had a number of different goals, including, most importantly, gender equality, women's empowerment and their full participation on the basis of equality in all spheres of society. Fundamental to achieve equality in general. That was always part of the UN's message. We cannot alleviate poverty, hunger. We cannot alleviate conflict and war, nor can we spread development and education, unless, of course, girls and women are included in those basic aspects, and as leaders, as well as in the population. And we need to develop, obviously, broadly, development and peace. Now, the target, of course, was defined, and it was defined, I think, partly because we've already had it in the MDGs, and because it's something which is relatively easily measurable. The IPU, Interparliamentary Union, has always had figures since the 80s, which has monitored the proportion of women in parliament. And so we go from this very grand statement of women's full and effective participation and equal opportunities at all levels, down to some very specific things. The proportion of seats held by women in national parliaments and local governments, and in managerial positions in the private workforce. And this is measurable, and we can certainly see where the current situation is, with a quarter of all of the members of parliament, now women, and 36%, a third of women in local government and regional assemblies. So how does that look? And in particular, what we need to do, I think, is really think about these 4 dimensions, not one. So we need to include, in a broader definition of our goals, and the international community needs to recognize, cultural empowerment. What is that? Well, that's about the basic norms and values. That's about how people feel about sex roles and their role in society. That's about how we can bring up girls to feel that they are equal to boys and get equal opportunities. And we can measure this, even though official statistical offices are somewhat hesitant to do so. Since the original MDGs started, we have now got excellent global surveys, which includes the Gallup World Poll. It includes the World Values Survey, of which I'm a part. It includes all the regional barometers, for example, in Asia, or Latino Barometer, or the Afro Barometer. And it includes also many other academic attempts to monitor this, for example, in Europe, the European Social Survey. And so I've developed something called Gender Equality Values Index, GV, and it looks towards attitudes on 3 dimensions. It looks at politics, work, and education. Now, are there others? Yes, there are. But these are 3 which I think, and we can agree, are pretty fundamental. And we've measured those, for example, in the World Values Survey since 1981. In addition to cultural empowerment, we need to have civic empowerment. And that's about women's participation in civil society. And here again, the world has shied from trying to monitor this on a global basis. And it is a difficult issue to monitor, I agree. It's much easier to count the number of women in parliament, but we have got some data, and we can use a number of different indicators, whether it's voting turnout and the proportion of women and men who vote in any local, regional, or national election or European election. We've got indicators now on party activism, how many women are active as grassroots members or as secretaries within local branches or in other forms of party office in the executive, and NGOs. Again, the world has really moved on from when the early MDGs were created. So we have excellent measures now of participation in non-governmental organizations. One of the critical aspects of women's social capital and how women are active in trade unions, community associations, arts associations, local groups, a really important way that women participate, particularly in many developing societies where it provides a platform, an avenue to other forms of power. Decision-making, of course, that has to be there. But as a third pillar, we have to go beyond elected and appointed leadership, for example, to think about the judiciary. We know how critical that is. The United States has just seen the selection, nomination, and acceptance of the first woman, and also a woman who is Black, as the Supreme Court is being transformed. Now 4 out of 9 members are women. But nevertheless, that needs to be much more general. We need to think about state, local courts. We need to think about all the different areas of the law, and obviously executive office as well. The number of women who are the highest office in the land is not that changed, and very much the numbers diminished substantially. And lastly, policy empowerment. And this is the area I feel is most under threat, which is about the law and the way in which we can think about policy outputs and outcomes. And issues in particular, as we've seen, on reproductive rights are being pushed back in countries such as in Central and Eastern Europe, as well as in the United States. And in other countries, we can see other types of policy issues, whether it's about equal pay, it's about property, access to justice, which again, we see uneven progress and sometimes reversals. So what's the evidence? And here I'll briefly summarize some of the evidence just to update us, to think about what the trends are. And culture. Remember I mentioned that we need to measure that by women in politics, in jobs, and in education. And the GV index combines 3 survey items from the European Value Survey and the World Value Survey. And we've monitored this from 1995 to 2020. So we have over 117 societies now, an enormous data set of individuals. We have some time series for a smaller set of 73 countries. All of the data is available to break down at the worldvaluesurvey.org. What do the trends look like? Well, this is the last 2 decades when I summarize across the world, and the Gender Equality Index combines these 3 items. On the whole, men make better political leaders than women. Men have more rights to a job. A university education is more important for a boy than a girl. And again, we have green, which are the highlights of the highest scores on the GV index. And we have orange as the moderate and red as the lowest scores. And this is, as we say, many, many societies, over 100, not every country and not every part of the world. I'm part of the World Value Survey. We're still struggling to cover many African countries and sub-Saharan Africa. But nevertheless, this is a broad picture. And what can we say? The good news, as you can see, we might expect that Europe, and particularly Scandinavia, of course, are high in attitudes towards gender equality, and that's absolutely the case. Scores of 90% or so in the Norways, the Swedens, the Finlands of the world. But look more generally. Again, the United States, you might think, has become a more socially conservative view on many issues. But when we look at gender equality, in fact, it's become more egalitarian over the long term. And it's relatively egalitarian worldwide. So is Australasia, and so is Latin America, which again is very good news. There we see scores again in the 70s to 80s, despite some pushback in a number of countries against women's rights. What about the rest of the world? Well, of course, the pattern is much more checkered. And you can see still the big differences between Western and Eastern and Central Europe. The post-communist legacy continues. We can see a difference. It's not absolute, but nevertheless, women lag behind in the Hungary, Poland, the Czech Republics, as well, of course, as in Belarus, as in Russia. And we can see even in China and in many other parts, we can see a moderate score. And again, the Middle East, the MENA region, and North America have some of the lowest scores amongst the countries, of course. We would expect that because of the traditions, and we've documented that on many occasions. So that in itself gives us the global picture. What's the picture of the gender gaps in cultural empowerment? So what I've done is I've taken that GV index and I've broken it down for women and men in the classic colors, pink and blue. And what we can look at is the gap in support for gender equality in the regions of the world. And what jumps out from this graph, which goes from the 1990s through to 2020, is that there's a gap in terms of how far women are endorsing gender equality. They're always much more in favor of that than men. And interestingly, the gap is of roughly similar size across all of the different types of world regions. So of course, in Western Europe, North America, and Australasia, post-industrial societies, there is a gap and it continues. So all attitudes become more liberal slightly on this index, but still men lag behind. And we can see a same pattern in Asia Pacific, where it's much lower in terms of support, Latin America, the MENA region and so on, with the biggest gap in sub-Saharan Africa with some of the most traditional cultures. Some little bit of evidence that it might be slightly diminishing as a gender gap there, but nevertheless. So the conclusion from our cultural power is that has there been change? Yes, it's been slow but persistent, particularly generational, but nevertheless differences persist between women and men's support for gender equality. And again, just to show you some of the changes, here's some of the gains which have been made. And it's not simply in the affluent countries of the world, it's in Uruguay, Albania, Romania, Estonia, Poland, Taiwan, Georgia. Many of these countries have seen a strong improvement, relatively speaking, a 10 to 15 point gain in support for gender equality in the period from the mid-90s to 2000s and so 2010, the last decade. Now, at the same time, however, we can say that there has been some loss and some countries have regressed, not enormously, but there has been some regress, including in India, which is a critical country where support for gender equality has gone down, Pakistan similarly, the Philippines, Nigeria, Bangladesh, some of the poorest countries in the world, South Africa. And again, not enormous losses over this long period, but some loss. And some countries, as we can see, no gains really substantially, a Russia, a Chile, Azerbaijan, and Sweden. And this matters. As this chart shows, what we have here is the GEVI index on the vertical index and the proportion of women in parliament on the horizontal. And you can see there is a relationship. So the stronger the culture, which is in favor of gender equality across those three dimensions, broadly speaking, the higher the number of women in parliament and vice versa. Now, of course, there are some scatters. In particular, you'll notice Rwanda off to the right bottom corner, where there's been, of course, substantial gains for women in the legislature, but it's been an elite level process rather than one in the culture as a whole. And you can also look in the top left quadrant, and amongst the countries there, as well as Hungary and Brazil and Uruguay, is the United States. So what that suggests is that women have had a greater shift in attitudes towards gender equality in the culture than there has been progress in the House of Representatives, the Senate, and women in the National Congress. And of course, some countries remain ultra conservative, whether it's Iran, Kuwait, Qatar, Yemen, Egypt, which goes up and down, etc., etc. So a varied pattern worldwide. And when I try to look at the factors which are explaining the proportion of women, again, we find if we look at the factors of a simple correlation that gender equality is strongly and significantly correlated, the culture matters, 0.54, but other factors matter, including democracy and, of course, the use of quotas, which I'm sure will be discussed later in the program when we talk about women in decision-making in one of the later panels with my good friend, Drude Dalrup. Now, I'll just briefly mention the other dimensions, women and civic empowerment. And that's about the ability of all of us to influence the policy process indirectly, not through elected office, but through all the other channels, whether it's the interest groups, unions, religious groups, social movements, and so on. And again, we've got some indicators of what we can look at for some of these indicators from the Variety of Democracy project. And what we've got here is an index which is constructed by the Variety of Democracy project, which uses expert estimates of restrictions on women's participation in civil society. Now, we can talk about experts. Are they actually giving us independent information? The point is, it's a good way of looking at trends. Even if the estimates are in many ways flawed or inadequate, nevertheless, we can assume that at least the trends might be something that we can work with. And here we have a century of change broken down by region. And remember, this is restrictions which are lifted on women's participation in civil society organizations. A higher score is more positive. And what can you see? Well, from 1920, we can see a gradual rise in many countries, often flat at the beginning, particularly, for example, in Africa. But we can see a rise that continues in particular in the post-Second World War era, where there's often a jump. And we can see that the numbers engaged in civil society does go up a lot, according to the index. But let's look at the most recent pattern, and that's highlighted by the arrows. And so I've just taken the period from 1990, the beginning of the SDGs, through to date 2020. And what you can see is that in Central and Eastern Europe and Central Asia, it's flat. In Latin America, no further gains from the 1990s, despite Beijing, despite all of our efforts, despite the organizing that's been going on at grassroots level, according to the VDEM data, no improvements. In Western Europe, North America, and Australia, also flat, and therefore no changes. What we can also see, however, is that the MENA region, interestingly, has had the most substantial rise, according to this, now from a low point, admittedly, but nevertheless, women have been getting engaged through religious organizations, through social organizations, and through community groups, and a bit of a rise still in sub-Saharan Africa. And in Asia Pacific, it goes down. So again, what's the gap? Well, there are various ways to measure this. Is it the case that we've got equality now in civic engagement? Here's an indicator of political discussions. And this is how much, when you get together with friends, you discuss politics. So it's not formal activism like a card-carrying membership of a trade union, but just how much engaged are people when they discuss with your friends political matters. And it goes from high frequently to never. And what we can see is that, in fact, the pattern varies quite a bit from one place to another in terms of the trends, but also that the gap persists. And so if you look at, for example, starting with Western Europe, North America, and Australasia, which is the post-industrial countries, then the political discussion goes up, but still men are more likely to discuss politics than women. And if we look at Latin America, it's a gap which is going in the wrong direction. MENA, an enormous gap. Eastern Europe, a gap which goes worse. In other words, women are less likely to discuss politics and men are less likely to discuss politics over time, but the gap persists. And you can see for yourself the changes in sub-Saharan Africa and in other parts like Asia Pacific. So there's still a gap, even in the most basic aspect of civic engagement, which is talking about politics. And it persists when we look at demonstrating. This is whether or not you've participated in a protest, a peaceful protest, a legal protest. And we've again monitored this in the World Value Survey. We've got 53 societies worldwide to look at the trends. And again, the blue line for men, more likely to have participated in demonstrations. The pink line for women, less likely to have demonstrated. And the gap persists, slightly closing in MENA, but elsewhere there's a gap. And it's one which is even there in some of the most culturally advanced countries in favor of women's equality. Well, let's then thirdly look at the decision-making process. And again, I won't go into this in detail because I'm sure this audience is very familiar with the global patterns. And these are the estimates of the women in legislative office and in executive office. as you reach the higher levels. So a century of women in parliament from the Varieties of Democracy project. And of course, progress monitored in Latin America, very substantial since the 1990s, especially a big progress in Europe and North America, Western Europe, that is, from the 1970s. That's when the progress starts, and it continues through to date. See similar levels of progress, but at a lower level, again in sub-Saharan Africa and in Asia Pacific, although again at a lower level. And of course, the biggest outlier, Eastern Europe and Central Asia, which is of course the end of the Soviet Union and the fall of the Berlin Wall, and new independence, whereupon many of the gender quotas that were there in communist parties were abandoned before a subsequent climb back. And by the way, still back to a position which is less generous than it was actually under the communist regimes. And gender quota laws, again, I'm sure people are going to talk about that, so I won't tread on their area, but we can immediately see the adoption of a century of gender quota laws, nothing much happening, of course, in the early era, a couple of countries, Oni, Bangladesh, and a couple of others, but we can see from the 70s and particularly from the 1990s, look at Eastern Europe and the adoption of gender quotas, Latin America leading the way in Argentina, and then subsequent other countries, the MENA region adopting them, particularly Sub-Saharan Africa, Western Europe, less so in Western Europe, of course, because women changed the party rules. And so they were able to use informal and party-led rather than legal changes, and Asia Pacific, a somewhat lagged process. And part of this, you might assume, went along with changes in liberal democracy, but in fact, it's far more complex, as we know nowadays. And what we can see here is the level of liberal democracy from VDEM on the horizon, on the vertical index, the percentage of women in the lower house in 2019 on the horizontal index, and immediately you can see a scatter all over the place. So some democracies, of course, have been very positive for getting women into office. The Costa Ricas, the Belgians, the Austrias, the Icelands, Taiwan, Tunisia for a short-term period, Argentina, South Africa, and so on. But we can also see there are outliers. And again, Rwanda jumps out. But of course, other communist countries, post-communist countries like Cuba, Nicaragua, Mozambique, and then other countries which are democratic, of course, continue to lag, led here by Japan for cultural reasons, but also some other African countries like Ghana, Botswana, Mongolia, Sri Lanka, and so on. And at the top, at the peak, women as heads of government and heads of state, very, very few. And again, Marine Le Pen is fighting for France, and we'll have to see what happens there. There are other reasons why that outcome is very complicated, but nevertheless, we can see that the proportion worldwide, for example, in sub-Saharan Africa, despite some leading figures that we can all think about, has been very low. And the same absolutely is true, even more so in the MENA region. And we can see similar cases in Latin America to a slower extent, although women as heads of government has pushed forward, particularly following the rise of quota laws and the number of women in congresses. So the last area, which I think is some of the most concerning, I hope to finish off so we have a little chance for any Q&A, policy empowerment. And this is about the actual choices and laws governing women's independence and women's rights, our sexual and reproductive choices and economic independence. And again, we have some policy indicators from the Variety of Democracy project on whether or not countries respect women's freedom of domestic movement, private property, freedom from forced labor, and access to justice. Are these policy indicators enough? No, they're not. Are they basic? I think they are. And if you don't have those, you're unlikely to have other forms of policy empowerment. And here's the century of change in the estimates which pull together women's policy empowerment. And the story is one again of differences across regions, but we can see some advances, and then also we can see some stabilization, a plateau. And I'd argue that in the more advanced forms of policy empowerment, like reproductive rights, there has been an active decline in many countries that we look at. So what's the overall pattern and what's the argument to finish? The emerging threats. Again, I won't go into these in detail. I think many of us are familiar. Yes, of course, there have been advances in cultural values, but socially conservative anti-gender movements have been very active. Hate groups, groups of extreme radical right, willing to use violence, willing to demonstrate, willing to push back on women's rights. And some of the most recent activities that we've seen have been very disturbing, and they exist in many of the world's most affluent countries and liberal democracies. Gains for authoritarian populist parties and leaders, which threaten and continue to implement rollback gains for women's rights. And in America, in particular, we can look at some of the evidence, whether it's Donald Trump, but particularly now in the governors in the states, and the ways in which they're pushing back, even on the discussion of gender in schools, even on the discussion of transsexual rights, or even on issues of LGBTQ and issues of reproductive rights. And of course, we all know that the loss of Roe v. Wade is on the horizon. States are pushing already laws to shut down on reproductive rights in a dramatic way. And the Mississippi case before the Supreme Court, everybody looks to see what's going to be the future in America post Roe v. Wade. How far, by the way, authoritarian populist parties continue to rise, or whether there's been a slight plateau or even decline, just in recent elections, is still a question that's being debated. There's some evidence that they might have peaked, but on the other hand, what's also evident is that some of their issues have been just absorbed, and the anti-immigrant message, for example, by some of the other mainstream conservative parties. Violence against women, I'm sure, will be discussed later in the conference. It's been one of the major areas, but particularly in the public sphere. And I think that's something which is of growing recognition. It's always been there, but I think the threats have been exacerbated now. And COVID, of course, has had a tremendous impact on everybody, but particularly on women. And as women are a high proportion of the vulnerable population, and working at home has isolated women in the workplace and reduced their gains, particularly if they had to combine childcare and paid employment, as well as having other consequences by undermining democracy and weakening parliaments and legislatures where women had made some gains. And this is the last chart I'll show you, and it's whether or not parties favor or oppose women's rights by their social values and populist rhetoric. So this is part of my global party survey, and I conducted this in 2019 with elites and just asked the question, does a party in your country, and we list 8 parties per country, favor or oppose women's rights? And so what we have is across the bottom, whether a party favors or opposes women's rights, and on the vertical axis, whether or not they are liberal or conservative. And what you can see is that, of course, many of the most authoritarian populist parties are firmly against women's rights and also highly conservative, whether we're talking about Spain's Vox, we're talking about parties like the AfD in Germany, Turkey under Erdogan, Fidesz with Hungary and Viktor Orban, who just got re-elected with a majority. There is France, and labeled FN, Front National, now the Assembly, French rally for France. And everybody says Marine Le Pen has changed, but the party, according to this, remains highly conservative and opposing women's rights in general, along with parties in Slovakia, in Sweden, in Austria, the Brexit party there in Britain, and so on. So all of those parties in the top right-hand corner are parties which are pushing back and coming to power and having a major impact on the mainstream parties as well. So the lessons, we've focused too narrowly. There has been global advances, but also some slowing down. And the recommendations, monitor multidimensional sex segregated indicators. It's no longer adequate for official statistics and member states to say, oh, we can't do that. We can, we've got evidence. Is it perfect? No. But can we use it to look at the trends? Nowadays we can. We need to address the impact of COVID And we need to think in particular as a group, as a community, and as a conference on effective strategies to defend the gains and resist the anti-gender movements. I hope that that's given a useful overview. I really much welcome your thoughts and ideas, and I hope that we can build on that in the subsequent panels as part of this event. Thank you very much, and thank you for inviting me.
Thank you. I hope you can hear the applause. Now, I would like to open the floor for Q&A.